In May, the public inquiry into what's become known as the Contaminated blood scandal will publish its findings. The inquiry was set up by the then Prime Minister Theresa May in 2017. It's been dubbed the worst scandal in the history of the NHS. In a new series, Blood Matters, Blanche Girouard hears some of the stories behind the headlines.
In the 1970s and 80s, thousands of NHS patients became seriously ill after being given a new treatment for haemophilia. The blood products they received were contaminated with HIV and hepatitis B and C. Many of them were children at the time.
I do remember feeling properly sort of sick at school. My immune system was depleting and any opportunistic infection was it just leapt on me.
For years, many were left in the dark about the true nature of their illness.
Towards the end of the consultation, he turned around and said to me, "You do know you're HIV positive, Richard, don't you?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that." It was truly shocking.
Over 1,100 of the haemophilia patients infected have since died, and tens of thousands of family members have been affected.
I was just terrified to talk about any of it because I remember being told pretty much from the get-go that what had happened to my mum and dad, I was better off just not talking about it or mentioning it to anyone.
I'm Blanche Girouard, and I've followed the NHS blood contamination scandal for years, listening to the stories of the infected and affected as they wait for justice. More than 4 decades on, no one has been held to account.
Who infects a 10-month-old baby with hepatitis and AIDS, for Christ's sake? If I'd have done it, they'd have locked me away.
For BBC Radio 4, this is Blood Matters, Episode 1, The Wonder Drug. Hello. How nice to see you. It's been ages.
Yeah, nice to see you.
And this is Mike.
Must be Mike. Hello, Andy.
You're being recorded.
Nice. Oh.
I first met Andy Evans in 2018, a year after the public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal was announced by the government. Andy's story shocked me, and as I read and listened to similar stories, I realised the seriousness of what had been allowed to happen. Today I'm back in Evesham, Worcestershire, where Andy still lives with his wife, 3 children and 2 very large and noisy dogs.
Wow, you are huge.
No, you stay down. And you, down.
When did you get these? They're enormous.
3 years old.
Andy looks paler than the last time we met. So let's go back to the beginning of the story. When was it discovered that you had haemophilia?
It was discovered that I had haemophilia about 11 months. And the reason was that I was just starting to learn how to walk. And I wasn't very good at it and kept falling on my butt. But they started to notice that it was swelling on my thigh and my hip. And they took me into the hospital to see what was going on.
Seeing the swelling and bruising, the doctors initially thought that Andy was being neglected, even beaten, by his parents. Eventually, they discovered that he suffered from haemophilia, a genetic condition that causes a lack of the essential blood-clotting protein known as Factor VIII, so that even a small injury can cause massive blood loss. For Andy and his family, life was about to change dramatically.
My parents were new to it. It wasn't in my family, because haemophilia is usually hereditary, but about a third of cases aren't. And so my parents hadn't got a clue. All they knew was what the hospital was telling them, and that was to try to keep me from banging myself or cutting myself or twisting joints, that sort of thing. And so I suppose it was quite a conservative childhood, as in when I first learned to ride a bike, they thought that the saddle might give me a bleed, so they wrapped it in foam rubber.
And so in those early days, how was it treated if you did have a bleed?
In the very early days, so I would have been, 1, 2, 3, I was treated with a product called cryoprecipitate.
Cryoprecipitate is a frozen blood product prepared from blood plasma taken from a single blood donor. It was introduced in the UK in the 1960s and was an effective way of treating bleeding in people with haemophilia, like Andy. But it had several drawbacks, It had to be defrosted before use and always had to be administered via transfusion in hospital.
They'd take you into a side room, set up a drip stand, put the cryo bags on the top of the drip stand, try and find a vein, which wasn't that easy as a youngster, and just wait and just let the cryo do its thing.
This is Richard Warwick, who's 12 years older than Andy Evans. He was a toddler when doctors concluded that his bruising, sprains and fractures were also down to haemophilia, and he was given cryoprecipitate, or cryo, at his local hospital in Scarborough, North Yorkshire.
It was very cold, you could feel it racing around your body, because it was frozen, it was straight out the deep freeze. They tried their best to bring it up to room temperature, up to body temperature, but it was always freezing cold. You could feel it searing round the back of your neck and down your arms. So it was very unpleasant, and I used to have terrible reactions to it.
What were the reactions?
Sweating, shivering, rashes, almost hives. But I did have some quite bad anaphylactic shocks to cryo, and that went on for a long while.
And how long did it take being given cryo?
The problem was that the actual infusion didn't take up that much time, is they needed to keep an eye on me afterwards as well. And so it could be 4 or 5 hours in hospital.
Because of the disadvantages of cryoprecipitate, doctors were always on the lookout for an alternative. By the early 1970s, a freeze-dried blood concentrate of the Factor VIII protein that haemophiliacs were lacking became available. It was a breakthrough, because this new product could be mass-produced, stored more easily, and used more conveniently than cryoprecipitate. But it required the blood plasma of a very large group of donors, which made it far more likely to carry any infection that a donor might have. Andy Evans was just 3 when he was first given this new Factor VIII product.
It was so much quicker and easier than cryoprecipitate. You wouldn't be on an infusion. They'd push it in by syringe over about 5 minutes, something like that. So once it was in there, you were done, and you could, go rest up, and hopefully your bleed would settle down fairly quickly after that.
And so to begin with, that was in hospital, and then what happened?
Then shortly after that, probably at about the age of 4, they started to introduce home treatment. And so we were allowed to take the Factor VIII away and store it in the fridge, had to be kept cold. And my parents were taught how to, my mum really, was taught how to prepare it and to give the injection and to how to infuse it over a certain period of time, and then make sure there was no subsequent bleeding afterwards. And so that's what we did.
Am I right in thinking, though, that you were able to inject yourself quite early?
Yeah, one of the occasions when they were having difficulty in the hospital, I was around 3 years and 10 months, so they say. But anyway, they handed me the needle, and apparently, I don't remember it myself, but I got straight into a vein and never looked back.
So, did Factor VIII make life easier for your parents and yourself than cryo?
So much easier, because we had to stay close to hospitals when it was cryo. And home treatment in particular made it easier, because we could actually go on holiday. We'd never sort of sought to venture away from the vicinity of the Children's Hospital in Birmingham before that, just in case. And so, they started to take us camping and things like that in Wales. And that was the big difference, I think, from what my parents have told me to having to go and sit in a hospital and stay on bed rest and all of that sort of thing. It was much more convenient.
And also presumably more reassuring for them than the anxiety of having to be near a hospital.
Yeah, not only the anxiety of having to be near a hospital, but having a product that was specifically designed to target the clotting factor that I was missing.
Was it a wonder drug?
Yeah, I guess it was.
Richard Warwick began treatment with the new Factor VIII product in 1975, when he was 9. He was attending Lord Mayor Treloar's College in Alton, Hampshire, a boarding school for children with physical disabilities and for those with haemophilia. Treloar's was a long way away from home, and Richard remembers feeling very homesick. But for the first time in his life, his schooling wasn't being interrupted by hospital visits, and he could take part in activities in the school's rambling setting.
It was like something out of, Harry Potter or something like that. It was this Elizabethan mansion set in these wonderful grounds. It was incredible.
And he had access to this new treatment at an on-site NHS-run haemophilia centre.
There was a specialist sick bay at Trelaws, and there you would be ushered into a small room, no bigger than this lounge. You just lay your arm out on the table and they would inject whatever it was that they had at the time to treat your bleed. We didn't know what we were being given. We had no inkling of where it came from. All we knew was that it was to treat our bleeds, so we complied.
Between 1974 and 1987, more than 120 children at Trelaws College were given the Factor VIII concentrate for treating their haemophilia. Because the treatment centre was located in a boarding school, the doctors had uninterrupted access to a large number of boys with haemophilia and were able to treat them exclusively with the new product and monitor its effects. Richard remembers coming down to dinner one day to find that he and the other boys with haemophilia were being separated from other pupils.
As we went down the slope into the dining room, the haemophiliacs were set aside and directed towards a long wooden table where we were sat down and were faced with these blue plastic plates with red stickers on. And the cutlery was also marked with red paper dots, as were the serving dishes. And it was so weird. We couldn't understand why we were being segregated from the rest of the pupils at the school.
What did they say to you?
Nothing. They said absolutely nothing. They gave no reason as to why we were being separated from the other pupils.
Years later, Richard learned that this segregation had been due to an outbreak of hepatitis B among the boys with haemophilia, caused, unknown to them, by the Factor VIII they were receiving. Thankfully, Richard did not contract it, but he was later struck down by a mystery illness which the doctors could not identify.
A lot of other boys at the school came down with these swollen glands. They assumed it was glandular fever, had all the symptoms of glandular fever. And I had 2 tests, and in my notes it says, looks like glandular fever to me. And on both occasions, looks like glandular fever to me. And both tests came back negative for glandular fever. And we now know that is those swollen lymph nodes and glands were caused by HIV.
Were you or your parents ever told that the Factor VIII could give you a risk of infection?
No.
And is it possible, by any stretch of the imagination, that you or they forgot they were being told?
No, that wouldn't happen.
It would be years before Richard was told that he had HIV, which causes AIDS, and that it had come from the very same blood product that he and the other boys had been given to save their lives. Factor VIII, the wonder drug, had poisoned them. Next time on Blood Matters, we hear how the Factor VIII product became contaminated with HIV and other viruses, and how the news was broken to some of the youngsters who'd been infected.
He lifted his left hand and went round the room and pointed at us and said, you have got HIV.
And which were you? Who had it or didn't have it?
I had it, yeah.
Blood Matters was presented by Blanche Girouard. The producer was Mike Lanchin. The series is a CTVC production for BBC Radio 4. Details of support with some of the issues raised are available at bbc.co.uk/actionline.